The neon lights of Tokyo blurred into a dizzying kaleidoscope as I stumbled out of the subway station. My heart raced, palms sweaty as I clutched my phone, its battery life dwindling along with my hope of finding my way back to the hotel. I never should have tried to explore the city alone at night. It had all started innocently enough. After a long day of sightseeing with my tour group, I was restless and eager to experience Tokyo's famous nightlife. While the others settled in for an early night, I decided to venture out on my own. How hard could it be? I'd memorized a few basic Japanese phrases and had Google Maps on my phone. What could go wrong? I confidently strode into the labyrinthine subway system, scanning the colorful signs and trying to match them to the station names on my phone. The crowds thinned as I made my way deeper into the network, transferring from line to line. I was heading to Shibuya, or at least I thought I was. At one transfer point, I hesitated, unsure which platform to take. An elderly Japanese man noticed my confusion and approached, speaking rapidly in Japanese. I smiled apologetically and tried my broken phrase. Sumimasen, Aigo jie hanasemasu ka? Excuse me, do you speak English? He shook his head but pointed insistently at one of the platforms. I bowed in gratitude, assuming he'd understood my destination. As I boarded the train, a nagging doubt crept in. The carriage was nearly empty, unusual for Tokyo, even at this late hour. Several stops later, I realized something was definitely wrong. The station names were unfamiliar, nothing like the trendy areas I'd researched. I decided to get off at the next stop and reassess. As I stepped onto the platform, my stomach dropped. This wasn't a bustling city station. It was small, dimly lit, and completely deserted. Graffiti marred the walls, and a cold breeze whistled through the tunnel. I pulled out my phone, but the battery icon flashed red, 5% remaining. Panic rising, I ran to the station map. The names were a jumble of kanji characters, completely indecipherable to me. I tried to open Google Maps, but the signal was weak, the app frustratingly slow to load. A distant rumble echoed through the station. Another train? Hope surged as I peered down the dark tunnel. But minutes passed and no train appeared. The rumble faded, leaving only an eerie silence. I climbed the stairs to street level, praying to find a main road or a taxi. Instead, I emerged into a narrow alley lined with shuttered buildings. Vending machines cast an otherworldly glow on the empty street. I spun around, trying to get my bearings, but every direction looked equally unfamiliar and foreboding. My phone chirped, 2% battery left. In desperation, I opened my translation app, typing, "How do I get back to central Tokyo?" The Japanese characters appeared on the screen, and I rehearsed the pronunciation, ready to ask the first person I saw. But there was no one. The streets were deserted, an unsettling quiet blanketing the neighborhood. I picked a direction and started walking, my footsteps echoing off the buildings. Every shadow made me flinch, imagination running wild with thoughts of Yakuza hideouts or abandoned, haunted districts. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I heard voices. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace. Rounding a corner, I saw two men standing under a flickering streetlight. They were dressed all in black, cigarette smoke curling around their heads. I approached cautiously, the translation ready on my lips. Sumimasen, I began, but the words died in my throat as they turned to look at me. Their eyes were cold, appraising. One man said something to the other, and they both chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. Every instinct screamed danger. I mumbled an apology and turned, walking away as fast as I could without breaking into a run. Their laughter followed me, along with the sound of unhurried footsteps. My heart pounded as I tried to lose them, taking random turns down alleys and side streets. But every time I thought I'd shaken them, I'd hear their voices or footsteps, always just out of sight but getting closer. I was fully lost now, in a maze of identical-looking streets. Exhaustion warred with fear as I leaned against a wall, trying to catch my breath. My phone was dead, my feet ached, and I had no idea how far I'd wandered from the station. A cat yowled nearby, making me jump. As I turned my head, I caught a glimpse of movement reflected in a shop window. Two dark figures at the end of the street. I didn't wait to see if it was my imagination. I ran. Adrenaline pushed me forward as I sprinted through the unfamiliar streets. I had no plan, no destination in mind other than away. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but still I ran. I don't know how long I kept going, but eventually I had to stop. Ducking into a narrow space between two buildings, I slid to the ground, gulping air and straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. Minutes ticked by in tense silence. Gradually, my breathing slowed, and I began to take in my surroundings. The alley opened onto a slightly wider street, and at the end, I could see the glow of what looked like a main road. Hope flickered as I stumbled towards a light. As I got closer, I could make out signs for businesses, a 24-hour convenience store, a late-night ramen shop. My steps quickened. Where there were open shops, there would be people, maybe someone who could help me. I burst onto the main street, nearly sobbing with relief at the sight of other humans. It wasn't exactly bustling, but compared to the ghost town I'd been lost in, it was a metropolis. A couple of salarymen stumbled out of a bar, while a group of teenagers loitered outside the convenience store. Gathering my courage, I approached the teenagers, figuring they were most likely to speak some English. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "I'm lost. Can you help me get back to?" I trailed off, realizing I couldn't remember the name of my hotel. The teens looked at me curiously, then began talking among themselves in rapid Japanese. One girl pulled out her phone and held it up to me. The Google Translate app opened on the screen. Relief washed over me. Through a comical game of charades and typing back and forth on her phone, I managed to explain my situation. The girl's eyes widened as she realized how far I'd strayed from the tourist areas. She spoke to her friends and then typed into her phone, "We will help you. Police box nearby. They can call taxi for you." I could have hugged her. The group led me down the street to a small police station. A Koban, I remembered they were called. The officer inside looked startled to see a disheveled foreigner at this hour, but quickly grasped the situation. While we waited for the taxi, the officer gave me a bottle of water and a map, circling the areas I should stick to on future nights out. I nodded gratefully, knowing I'd be far more cautious from now on. As the taxi pulled up, I turned to thank the teenagers who had helped me. They smiled and waved, calling out sayonara as I got into the car. I sank into the seat, exhaustion finally overtaking me as the driver pulled away. The neon-lit streets of central Tokyo gradually came into view, familiar landmarks appearing as we got closer to my hotel. I felt a mix of embarrassment at my naivety and profound gratitude for the kindness of strangers. When we finally pulled up to my hotel, I practically kissed the ground in relief. The night clerk looked alarmed at my appearance, but didn't ask questions as he handed over my room key. In the safety of my room, I plugged in my phone and fell onto the bed, my mind replaying the night's events. It had been a stark reminder of how quickly a dream vacation could turn into a nightmare, especially when language barriers and unfamiliarity collide. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a mental note. Tomorrow, I'd buy a portable charger, write down my hotel's address in Japanese, and maybe, just maybe, stick with a tour group for a while. Tokyo's hidden corners could wait until I was better prepared to explore them. The city's energy and mystery still called to me, but now I understood the importance of respecting its complexity. My adventure had been a harsh lesson, but also a testament to human kindness. In the end, it would become one of those travel stories, terrifying in the moment, but transforming into an invaluable experience that would shape all my future journeys. As I finally succumbed to sleep, the distant sounds of the city filtered through my window, a gentle reminder that Tokyo, in all its bewildering beauty, would be waiting for me in the morning, ready to be explored anew, this time with wiser eyes and a more cautious heart. The last passengers trickled out of the terminal, leaving me alone in the vast, echoing space. As the final announcement faded, an unnatural silence settled over the airport. I checked my watch. 11:43 p.m. My flight, originally scheduled for 7:15 p.m., now showed an estimated departure of 3:30 a.m. Little did I know, those next few hours would become the longest night of my life. It had started as a routine business trip. I was heading from Chicago to San Francisco for a conference, with a layover in Denver. The first leg went smoothly, but as soon as I landed in Colorado, the delays began. At first, it was just a minor setback, a 30-minute delay due to incoming storms. I settled into one of the uncomfortable chairs near my gate, pulled out my laptop, and got some work done. No big deal, I thought. I'd still make my connection. But 30 minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The storm intensified, sheets of rain lashing against the giant windows. Lightning illuminated the tarmac in brilliant flashes, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the entire terminal. As the hours ticked by, my fellow passengers grew restless. Families with crying children, business travelers pacing anxiously, elderly couples huddled together. We were all in the same boat, or rather, not in any boat at all, stuck on the ground as nature unleashed its fury outside. I struck up a conversation with the man next to me, a software engineer named Dave heading to a tech conference. We swapped stories about travel nightmares, each trying to one-up the other. It helped pass the time, but as midnight approached, Dave's name was called for a seat on a different flight. He gave me an apologetic shrug as he gathered his things. "Good luck," he said, disappearing into the dwindling crowd. And then there were few. The airport, once bustling with activity, grew eerily quiet. Shops pulled down their shutters, restaurants dimmed their lights. Even the incessant airport announcements became less frequent until they stopped altogether. I decided to stretch my legs, my back aching from hours in the molded plastic chair. Walking through the terminal was like moving through a ghost town. My footsteps echoed off the polished floors, and I could hear the hum of the air conditioning system, usually drowned out by the cacophony of travelers. As I rounded a corner, I spotted a small group of people huddled near a charging station. They looked up as I approached, their faces a mix of exhaustion and wariness. I nodded in greeting, plugging in my nearly dead phone. "Any news on your flight?" a woman asked, her voice hoarse from fatigue. I shook my head, still delayed. "You, canceled," she replied with a grimace. "They can't get us out until tomorrow afternoon. We're trying to find a hotel, but everything nearby is booked." I winced in sympathy, suddenly grateful for my delayed but still scheduled flight. We chatted for a while, sharing snacks from the vending machine, the only source of food still available. But one by one, they drifted off in search of comfortable spots to spend the night, leaving me alone once again. As I walked back to my gate, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned, but the corridor was empty. Must be my imagination, I thought, shaking my head. Sleep deprivation was clearly taking its toll. But then I saw it again, a shadow darting between the closed shops. My heart rate quickened. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the empty terminal. No response. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to get back to the relative safety of my gate. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few steps. When I finally reached my gate, I was surprised to see a handful of people still there, but something felt off. They sat unnaturally still, faces hidden behind books or phones. As I approached, none of them looked up or acknowledged my presence. "Excuse me," I said to the nearest person, a man in a rumpled suit. "Have they given any updates on the flight?" He slowly lowered his newspaper, and I had to stifle a gasp. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, his skin pale and waxy under the harsh fluorescent lights. When he spoke, his voice was monotone. devoid of any emotion. No updates. Please take a seat and wait for further instructions. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, bumping into another passenger. As I turned to apologize, I realized they all looked the same, blank stares, pale skin, moving with an odd, robotic quality. Panic rising in my throat, I hurried to the desk, praying to find a staff member who could explain what was happening. But the desk was empty, the computer screens dark. That's when the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then with a loud buzz. The entire terminal was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, a chorus of inhuman groans filled the air. My heart pounding, I fumbled for my phone, using its feeble light to navigate. The other passengers were rising from their seats, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Their eyes, reflecting the light from my phone, seemed to glow with an eerie, internal light. I ran. Through darkened corridors and empty concourses, I fled. Behind me, I could hear the shuffling of feet, the groans getting louder. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of mass hallucination? A bizarre prank? Or had I finally cracked under the stress and fatigue of travel? I found myself in the baggage claim area. The carousel sitting silent and still. Suitcases lay abandoned, some spilled open with clothes strewn about. It looked like people had left in a hurry. As I paused to catch my breath, a new sound reached my ears, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the direction of the security checkpoints. Curiosity warred with fear. Part of me screamed to find an exit, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But another part needed to know what was happening. Cautiously, I crept towards the source of the chanting. As I got closer, I could make out words, but in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded ancient guttural. Peering around a corner, I saw a sight that nearly stopped my heart. The security area had been transformed. The metal detectors and X-ray machines were pushed aside, forming a crude circle. In the center stood a group of people, airport staff, judging by their uniforms, swaying in unison as they chanted. And floating above them, pulsing with an otherworldly light, was something. It defied description, constantly shifting and changing. One moment it looked like a swirling vortex, the next like a mass of writhing tentacles. I must have made a noise, a gasp or a whimper, because suddenly all eyes turned to me. The chanting stopped. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then chaos erupted. The chanters rushed towards me, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light I'd seen earlier. The thing in the center let out a shriek that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I ran again, no destination in mind other than away. Through the twisting corridors of the airport, past darkened shops and restaurants, I fled. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran, or how many times I doubled back on my own path. The airport had become a labyrinth, familiar landmarks twisted into unrecognizable shapes by darkness and fear. Finally, I burst through a set of doors and found myself on the tarmac. Rain still poured from the sky, drenching me instantly. Lightning flashed, illuminating rows of silent planes. For a moment, I stood there, gasping for breath, the cool rain a shock to my system. Had I imagined it all? Was it just an extreme stress reaction to the delays and the isolation? But then I heard it, the chanting, growing louder. They were coming. I spotted a maintenance vehicle not far away, its keys still in the ignition. Without thinking, I sprinted towards it, my waterlogged shoes squelching with every step. Just as I reached for the door handle, a hand grasped my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around to face my attacker. Sir, calm down." The voice cut through my panic. I blinked, rain running into my eyes. It was an airport security guard, looking concerned and confused. Behind him, I could see other staff members and a few passengers, all staring at me with a mix of fear and worry. "Are you all right?" the guard asked, his grip on my shoulder loosening. "We've been looking everywhere for you. When you didn't respond to the announcements about the flight being canceled, we got worried. I looked around, disoriented. The rain was letting up, and I could see the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The airport behind me was fully lit, looking normal and benign in the early morning light. I don't understand, I stammered. The lights went out and the chanting and that thing. The guard exchanged a look with his colleagues. Sir, the power never went out. We've all been here all night. There was no chanting, no thing. I think maybe the stress of the delay got to you. Why don't we go inside and get you some coffee? As they led me back into the terminal, my mind reeled. Had it all been a hallucination? A vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress? I'll never be sure what really happened that night. But one thing's for certain, I'll never look at airport delays the same way again. And if I ever hear chanting in an empty terminal, I'm catching the first taxi out of there, storm or no storm. The lock clicked shut behind me, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty old building. Something about this place felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Little did I know, my budget-friendly accommodation was about to become the setting for the most terrifying night of my life. I'd arrived in Prague earlier that day, the latest stop on my backpacking trip across Eastern Europe. After a long train ride from Budapest, I was exhausted and looking forward to crashing for the night. My friend back home had raved about how hostels were the best way to travel cheap and meet people, so I booked a bed in a 6-person dorm at a place with decent online reviews. The hostel was housed in an old apartment building, all crumbling Baroque facade and winding staircases. The reception area was cozy enough, with mismatched furniture and travel posters covering the walls. The girl at the desk barely looked up from her phone as she handed me my key and pointed me toward the rooms. I lugged my backpack up 3 flights of creaky stairs, the old wood groaning under each step. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in places to reveal patches of crumbling plaster beneath. I found my room at the end of the hall and took a deep breath before entering. The dorm was small, with 3 bunk beds crammed into the space. A couple of backpacks were already stashed under the beds, but the room was empty. I claimed a bottom bunk, stowed my bag, and decided to freshen up before my roommates returned. The shared bathroom was just across the hall. As I washed my face, I caught movement in the mirror and spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Must be more tired than I thought, I mused, chalking it up to travel fatigue. Back in the room, I sprawled on my bunk and scrolled through my phone, planning the next day's sightseeing. That's when I heard the door open. 2 guys walked in, speaking to each other in hushed tones in a language I couldn't place. They stopped abruptly when they saw me. "Oh, hello," I said, sitting up. "I'm Jake." They stared at me for a moment before the taller one replied, "I'm Miklos. This is Andre." His accent was thick, Eastern European, but I couldn't pinpoint where exactly. "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly despite their odd behavior. "Where are you guys from?" They exchanged a look before Andre answered, "Around." And with that, they climbed onto their bunks without another word. Okay, not the most sociable roommates, I thought. But hey, can't win them all. I decided to head out for dinner, hoping to find a bar where I might meet some friendlier travelers. As I was leaving, I noticed Miklos and Andre whispering again, shooting furtive glances my way. A tendril of unease crept up my spine, but I shook it off. I was in a new city, surrounded by different cultures. No need to get paranoid over a little awkwardness. I spent a few hours wandering the cobblestone streets of Prague, marveling at the Gothic architecture and trying my first taste of Czech beer. By the time I stumbled back to the hostel, pleasantly buzzed and exhausted, it was well past midnight. The building was quiet as I made my way up to my room. I opened the door as softly as I could, not wanting to wake my roommates. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, I could make out 4 figures in the bunks. Must be full house tonight, I thought. I changed quickly and climbed into bed, my eyes heavy with sleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Whispers. So faint I almost thought I was dreaming. But no, there it was again. I strained my ears, trying to make out words, but it was in that same unfamiliar language. I lay there, perfectly still, listening to the hushed conversation. There was an urgency to their tone that set me on edge. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and I heard the creak of someone getting out of bed. My heart began to race. Should I pretend to be asleep, sit up, and ask what was going on? Before I could decide, I felt a presence near my bunk. Through slitted eyes, I saw a figure standing over me, just watching. Every instinct screamed at me to jump up, to confront them, but fear kept me paralyzed. I regulated my breathing, trying to appear deeply asleep. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved away. I heard more creaking, the sound of bags being unzipped. What were they doing? My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Were they going through my stuff, planning to rob me, or something worse? The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and fitful dozing. Every sound jolted me awake. The rustle of bedsheets, footsteps in the hallway, the distant slam of a door. By the time the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, I was a nervous wreck. As soon as I deemed it late enough, I got up, trying to act casual as I gathered my things for a shower. The others appeared to be asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back as I left the room. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear my head. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was all just a product of too much beer and an overactive imagination. But as I reached for my toiletry bag, my blood ran cold. My wallet was gone. Panic seized me. I tore through my bag, praying I just misplaced it. But deep down I knew. Memories of the night before came flooding back. The whispers, the figures standing over me. They'd robbed me while I pretended to sleep. I rushed back to the room, ready to confront them, but stopped short at the door. What if they were dangerous? What if there were more of them? I was alone in a foreign country, with no money and no idea who I could trust. Taking a deep breath, I decided to go to the reception and report the theft. But as I walked in, I froze. The girl behind the desk wasn't the same one from yesterday. In fact, nothing looked the same. The cozy, mismatched furniture was gone, replaced by sleek modern decor. The travel posters had vanished, leaving bare, freshly painted walls. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, eyeing my confusion. I'm staying here," I stammered, "in room 304. My wallet was stolen last night." She frowned, tapping at her computer. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have a room 304. This is a 4-story building. Our rooms only go up to 208. My mind reeled. But that's impossible. I checked in yesterday. The girl at the desk gave me a key. "Sir, I've been working here for 3 years. We haven't had a check-in desk or physical keys in all that time. All our rooms use electronic key cards." I staggered back, my legs weak. "I don't understand. My roommates, Miklos and Andre." The receptionist's eyes widened. "Did you say Miklos and Andre?" When I nodded, she went pale. "Sir, you need to come with me right now." She led me to a small office and closed the door. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but there was an incident here about 5 years ago. 2 men, Miklos and Andre, were running a scam, posing as hostile workers and luring in tourists. They'd robbed them, sometimes worse. The police caught them, but not before." She trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. My blood ran cold as the implications sank in. "But that's impossible," I whispered. "They were there in my room all night." The receptionist gave me a sympathetic look. "Sir, I think you may have been staying somewhere else. Somewhere not safe. You're lucky you got out with just a stolen wallet." As the police took my statement and helped me contact my embassy, my mind struggled to make sense of it all. Had I somehow wandered into the wrong building? Was I drugged? Or had I experienced something that defied rational explanation. I'll never know for sure what happened that night in Prague, but one thing's certain, I'll never look at hostels the same way again. And if I ever hear whispers in the dark in a language I don't understand, I won't pretend to be asleep. I'll run and I won't look back. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the horizon into a shimmering mirage. I squinted, desperately scanning the endless sea of sand for any sign of my tour group. But there was nothing, just dunes stretching as far as the eye could see. As panic set in, a flicker of movement caught my eye. In the distance, palm trees swayed invitingly. An oasis, salvation, or so I thought. I'd always dreamed of exploring the Sahara, the romance of the desert, the allure of ancient cultures, the challenge of surviving in one of the world's harshest environments. It all called to me. So when I found a great deal on a guided tour, I jumped at the chance. Our group met in Marrakesh, a colorful whirlwind of a city that assaulted all the senses. There were 10 of us, mostly Europeans and Americans, led by a local guide named Youssef. He was a character straight out of central casting for a mysterious desert nomad. Weathered face, intense eyes, and a quiet demeanor that hinted at deep wells of knowledge. We spent a day getting to know each other over mint tea and couscous, Youssef briefing us on what to expect. The desert is beautiful, he said, his eyes far away, but it is also dangerous. Stay close, follow instructions, and you will be fine. The next morning, we piled into rugged 4x4S and set off. The landscape changed dramatically as we left the city behind. Lush farmland, giving way to rocky plateaus, and finally, the rolling dunes of the Sahara. Our first night camping under the stars was magical. We rode camels at sunset, the sky a riot of oranges and pinks. Around the campfire, Youssef told stories of desert spirits and ancient kingdoms buried beneath the sand. I fell asleep to the soft sound of wind over dunes, feeling like I'd stepped into another world. The trouble started on our second day in the deep desert. We'd left the camels behind, exploring some more remote areas by foot. The heat was intense, the sun a white-hot disk in a cloudless sky. Youssef kept reminding us to drink water, to stay close. I was near the back of the group, stopping frequently to take photos. The patterns in the sand, the way the light played over the dunes, it was all so mesmerizing. I didn't realize how far I'd fallen behind until I looked up and couldn't see the others. No problem, I thought. They're just over the next dune. I quickened my pace, scrambling up the slope. But when I reached the top, there was nothing but more sand. Okay, don't panic, I told myself. They can't be far. I shouted, my voice sounding thin and feeble in the vast emptiness. No response. I tried to retrace my steps, but the wind had already erased any trace of footprints. My heart began to race as the reality of the situation sank in. I was alone in the Sahara Desert. Youssef's warnings echoed in my head. Stay with the group. Don't wander off. The desert is dangerous. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. I knew I didn't have much time before nightfall, and the temperature would plummet. That's when I saw it. In the distance, a smudge of green against the golden sand. An oasis. Hope surged through me. Where there was water, there would be people, or at the very least, shelter and a chance to survive until I was found. I set off toward the patch of green, my pace quick despite the drag of sand against my boots. As I walked, doubt began to creep in. Hadn't Youssef mentioned mirages? Could I be hallucinating? But no, as I got closer, I could make out individual palm trees, their fronds waving in the breeze. The promise of shade, of cool water, spurred me on. The sun was kissing the horizon by the time I reached the outer ring of vegetation. I pushed through the palms, expecting to find a pool of clear water. Instead, I stumbled into a scene that stopped me in my tracks. There, in a clearing, was a collection of low, dome-shaped structures. They looked ancient, made of a material that seemed to blur the line between stone and sand. People moved between the buildings, dressed in flowing robes that I'd never seen before, not the traditional dress of modern Berbers or Tuaregs. For a moment, I thought I'd stumbled upon some hidden, traditional community, but as my eyes adjusted to the dimmer light beneath the palms, details began to jump out at me. The people's movements were off, too fluid, almost like they were gliding rather than walking, and their faces, I couldn't quite focus on them, as if they were constantly shifting. A chill ran down my spine despite the lingering heat of the day. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I took a step back, intending to retreat into the desert. I'd take my chances with dehydration over whatever this was. But as I moved, every head turned toward me in unison. A figure detached itself from the group, gliding toward me. As it got closer, I could see that what I thought was a face was more like a swirling vortex of sand. It spoke, and though I couldn't see a mouth, I heard the words clearly in my mind. "Welcome, traveler. We've been expecting you." My mouth went dry, and not just from dehydration. "Who? What are you?" The figure's head tilted, sand cascading in a mesmerizing pattern. "We are the ones who have always been here, the spirit of the desert made manifest." I shook my head, backing away. "This isn't real. It's a hallucination. The heat, dehydration." "Is it?" the figure asked, amusement in its voice. "Or have you simply strayed into a part of the desert that your kind has forgotten? There are older things in this world than your civilization, traveler, deeper magics than you can imagine." As it spoke, the oasis around us seemed to shimmer and shift. One moment, I saw the dome structures and palm trees. The next, it was a bustling market from centuries past. Then a grand palace, its spires reaching impossibly high. The visions flickered by faster and faster, a dizzying kaleidoscope of times and places. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The figure extended a hand formed of swirling sand. "To show you wonders, to open your eyes to the true nature of the desert, to make you one of us." I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something buried in the sand. I fell, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I gasped for breath, the world spun around me. The figure loomed over me, its sand form stretching and contorting. "Embrace it," the voice whispered in my mind. "Let go of your solid form. Become one with the desert." I felt the sand beneath me shift, starting to pull me down. Panic seized me. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, concentrating with all my might on reality, on the tour group, on Yusef, on the real desert I'd come to explore. "No," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "This isn't real." The pulling sensation stopped. Slowly, hesitantly, I opened my eyes. The oasis was gone. The sand creatures were gone. I was lying on my back in the open desert, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. A voice called out, distant but real, "Over here." I found him. Flashlight beams cut through the gathering darkness. I heard the rumble of engines, saw the bouncing headlights of approaching vehicles. Yusef's face appeared above me, etched with worry. "Are you all right? We've been searching for hours." I nodded weakly, accepting his help to sit up, as the rest of the group gathered around. Expressing relief and concern, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a mirage? A hallucination brought on by heat and fear? Or had I truly glimpsed something beyond the veil of normal reality? I never told the others what I saw. How could I explain it without sounding crazy? But as we drove back to our camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that the desert was watching me, that somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of our headlights, impossible wonders were waiting to be discovered. The Sahara had shown me its true face, a glimpse of mysteries older than civilization itself. And while part of me was terrified by the experience, another part longed to go back, to explore deeper, to uncover more of the desert's ancient secrets. As we reached the camp, Yusef caught my eye. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of understanding that made me wonder just how much he knew about the true nature of the desert he called home. "The Sahara is beautiful," he said quietly, echoing his words from days ago. "But it is also dangerous and full of secrets." He smiled, a knowing look that sent a shiver down my spine. "Perhaps next time you'll be ready to see more." I nodded, unsure if I was excited or terrified by the prospect. One thing was certain. My journey into the heart of the desert was far from over. The sands had whispered their secrets to me, and I knew I would return, drawn back by the promise of wonders beyond imagination. The last thing I remember clearly was the gentle lapping of water against wood and stone. Then the fog rolled in, thick and unnatural, swallowing the world around me. As the gondola glided into the unknown, I realized with growing dread that Venice's labyrinthine canals had become a trap, and I was caught in it. It was supposed to be a romantic evening. My wife and I had saved for years to celebrate our 10th anniversary in Venice, the city of love and mystery. We'd spent the day wandering through narrow alleys, marveling at centuries-old architecture, and indulging in too much gelato. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I surprised her with a twilight gondola ride. Our gondolier, Marco, was the picture of Venetian charm, salt and pepper hair, a striped shirt, and a voice made for serenading tourists. As we pushed off from the dock, he regaled us with stories of the city's history, pointing out hidden gems along the way. "And there," he said, gesturing to an ornate palazzo, its windows dark and shuttered, "is where the infamous Contessa Adriana lived. They say her ghost still wanders the halls, searching for her lost lover." My wife, Sarah, squeezed my hand, a delighted shiver running through her. She'd always been a sucker for a good ghost story. I smiled, enjoying her excitement more than the tale itself. We meandered through smaller canals, the grand buildings giving way to more modest homes. Lights flickered on in windows, and the aroma of garlic and tomatoes wafted from unseen kitchens. It was magical, like stepping into a living postcard. That's when I first noticed a mist. It started as wisps, curling around the corners of buildings and creeping across the water's surface. I thought nothing of it at first. Venice is surrounded by water, after all. Fog isn't uncommon, but this was different. It rolled in fast, unnaturally fast, and thick as cotton. Within minutes, we could barely see a few feet in front of the gondola. Marco's cheerful commentary faltered. "Strani," he muttered, frowning. "Strange. Is this normal?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. Marco shook his head, his easygoing demeanor replaced by tense concentration. "No, Signora. Not like this. We should head back." He began to turn the gondola, but in the thick fog, it was impossible to tell which direction we'd come from. The once charming narrow canals now felt claustrophobic, hemming us in on all sides. "Perhaps we should call for help," I suggested, pulling out my phone. No signal. Of course, Marco continued to navigate, but his movements became increasingly uncertain. We'd turned down one canal only to find it a dead end, forcing us to backtrack. The fog muffled all sound, creating an eerie silence broken only by the soft splash of Marco's oar and our own increasingly ragged breathing. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had we been out here for minutes or hours? The buildings looming out of the mist all looked the same, their features distorted and menacing in the low visibility. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. "Jack," she whispered, "I don't like this. Something feels wrong." I was about to reassure her when I heard it, a low, mournful sound echoing through the fog. It might have been a foghorn, but it sounded almost human, a wail of despair that sent chills down my spine. Marco crossed himself, muttering what sounded like a prayer under his breath. The gondola drifted to a stop as he peered into the mist, trying to get his bearings. That's when things went from unsettling to terrifying. A shape emerged from the fog, another gondola, gliding silently past us. But this one was wrong. It was old, ancient even, the wood weathered and rotting, and it was empty, moving of its own accord through the still water. I blinked hard, certain I must be seeing things. When I looked again, it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Sarah nodded, her face pale. Marco didn't respond, still focused on navigating. As we drifted through the fog, more impossible things began to appear and disappear. Ghostly figures walking on water, buildings that shouldn't exist, grand palazzos where I knew there should be modern apartments. At one point, I could have sworn I saw the water itself moving against the current, swirling in unnatural patterns. The wailing sound came again, closer this time. Marco's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear. Without warning, he began to row furiously, steering us down a narrow side canal. "Marco, what—" I began, but he cut me off. "We must go. Now. It's not safe." "What's not safe?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Marco shook his head vehemently. "Some things in Venice are better left undisturbed. The old stories, sometimes they are more than stories." A chill that had nothing to do with the damp air ran through me. I'd always been a skeptic, dismissive of ghost stories and supernatural claims. But here, lost in this nightmare fog, those certainties began to crumble. We emerged into a slightly wider canal, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Surely we must be getting close to more populated areas. But then I saw her. A woman stood on a small stone bridge ahead of us. She was dressed in an elaborate gown that might have been fashionable centuries ago, her hair piled high in an intricate style. As we drew closer, I realized with growing horror that I could see through her to the stonework of the bridge. The ghostly woman turned, fixing us with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through me. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and suddenly the air was filled with wailing. Not just hers, but a chorus of agonized voices. Marco shouted something in Italian and began to row with renewed desperation. The gondola rocked violently, nearly capsizing as we rounded a corner. Sarah clung to me, burying her face in my chest. I lost all sense of direction as Marco navigated a dizzying series of turns. The fog seemed alive now, reaching out with tendrils that tried to ensnare us. Ghostly hands clawed at the sides of the gondola. Faces peered out from windows and doorways, faces that were decades, centuries out of time. Just when I thought we couldn't take any more, when the terror and confusion had reached a fever pitch, we burst out of a narrow canal into a wider expanse of water. The fog began to thin, revealing the welcome sight of modern buildings and streetlights. Marco didn't slow down until we'd reached a well-lit dock. As soon as the gondola bumped against the wood, Sarah and I scrambled out on shaky legs. Marco followed, his face ashen. For a long moment, we all stood there in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The normal sounds of the city, distant music, voices, the lapping of water, seemed almost obscenely ordinary after what we'd experienced. What was that? I finally managed to ask. Marco shook his head, his eyes haunted. "There are old parts of Venice," he said slowly, "places where the veil between worlds is thin. Usually they sleep, but sometimes on certain nights." He trailed off, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But we are safe now. It is over." He refused payment for the ride, waving off our protests. As he prepared to leave, he paused, fixing us with an intense gaze. "You saw things tonight that few living people have seen. A gift, perhaps, or a curse. But a word of advice, do not speak of it to others. Some secrets are best left in the fog." With that cryptic warning, he pushed off from the dock, disappearing into the night. Sarah and I made our way back to our hotel in a daze, clinging to each other like lifelines. We tried to talk about it, to make sense of what we'd experienced, but words seemed inadequate. In the years since that night, We returned to Venice several times. It's still a beautiful city, still filled with romance and history, but now we see it with different eyes. In the twilight hours, when mist rises from the canals, we hurry back to well-lit areas, and we never, ever take a gondola ride after dark. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can still hear that mournful wailing, carried on the wind from some unseen canal, and I wonder about the secrets that Venice keeps, hidden in the fog and shadows of its ancient waterways. What other mysteries lie waiting to be discovered, or perhaps to discover us?